Amen. All right, we're ready for Mark chapter 5. As we continue our study through the Gospel of Mark, this is our outline that we're looking at and following. We are in the Galilean ministry, which carries us from chapter 1 through chapter 8. And subdividing that a little bit, as Stouffer does, we have looked at his popularity growing as every gospel pictures the ministry as it kind of explodes and multitudes are following him. So there's the popularity that builds, there's the conflict that starts. We looked last week at the parables, and then there is his identity, who he is, evidence of who he is. And so that's what we're going to focus on in our study this morning. Let's review the first 4 chapters. Chapter 1 was beginning of the Galilean ministry. Chapter 2, conflict with the Pharisees. Good. Chapter 3. Yeah, controversy over the Sabbath healing. This is where that controversy started in chapter 2 and then in chapter 3. So there's the popularity that built. The multitudes are growing, and then the conflict starts. And then last week, what happened? Parables. He's teaching on parables. And his teaching was not widely accepted, obviously. It was the miracles that they liked, not for what they meant, but what they got out of them and what they saw is what they were interested in. Question number 1 for today. What is chapter 5 about? Yeah, 3 miracles are recorded here. And we're going to see what those 3 miracles are. There is the one of the demon-possessed man that was healed, verses 1 through 20. And then the second section has actually 2 miracles in one. They're actually 2 distinct miracles, but they're always in all 3 accounts grouped together. And what I mean by that is there's the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter, and right in the middle of that, on his way to go see about this daughter, then there's this woman who touches him and she's healed. And so we're right in the middle of that story, but we list that as a separate miracle. So here are 3 miracles. We're going to see the powers that he had, and we'll list those powers here in just a few moments. So before we get any further, we've been trying to do this each time. Let's look at parallel accounts, or at least list them. If you're making marginal notes, if you have a center reference column Bible, you'll probably already have that. If you don't and want to make a marginal note, this would be a good time to do that. But in Mark 5, 1 to 20, the story of the healing of the casting out of the demons and putting them into the swine is recorded in Matthew 8, 28 to 34, and in Luke 8, 26 to 39, and you notice John doesn't mention this. Again, John has 92% original material, so meaning most of what he says is not repeated in the synoptics. And we'll come back to the other passages that are parallel here in just a moment, and so you'll see this slide again. But that's Matthew 8, 28 to 34, and Luke 8, 26 to 39. We'll reference those here in just a moment and see what the comparisons and the distinctions are. And there are distinctions, and there are some things in one that's not in the other. All right, let's talk about this demon-possessed man who's healed. Verses 1 to 5 tell us about his condition and where he was and who he was and what we know about him. The text says they came to the other side of the sea. Now, typically the other side usually referred to the east side of the sea is typically right. I'm not saying that's always the case, but here we have the Sea of Galilee, and when they talked about because so much time is spent around Capernaum right here and Bethsaida, when they talk about the other side, they usually talked about the east side. Well, it's down in this region where it is thought the events of verses 1 to 20 take place. The man is later seen at the end of this section teaching and or telling people in Decapolis what's going on, what happened to him, and so it's in that region where all this takes place. Now, there's some translation issue, which we won't get into at verse 1, the country of the Gadarenes, and you'll notice a footnote that lists 2 or 3 other ways of wording that, and so there is some question exactly where is that located. Well, we don't know exactly, but it's along that shore or about 6 miles southwest of the Sea of Galilee is the best guess that I've been able to find. And so that just answered the question number 2 if you don't already have an answer to that. But let's read about his condition here. When Jesus came out of the boat, when he came to this side, what did he find? Found this man with unclean spirit. All right, there's a man with an unclean spirit who come out of the tombs, perhaps a cave-like tomb, not a tomb as we think of as burying in the ground, but much like the tomb of Jesus hewn out of a rock that he lived in. He's living as a wild man, basically. Now, let me stop and footnote just for a moment. Some of the more modernistic commentators, by modernistic it means they reject the inspiration of the Scriptures and try to give a natural explanation for all that takes place, have argued that this was just simply mental illness the man had. Well, one of the evidences that this is not mental illness is not typically ever taken out of one person and cast into swine and make the swine then behave erratically. That tells us it was an unclean spirit. It was demon possession, which is limited to the time of Christ on earth. But be that as it may, he lived in tombs, the text tells us. Now, let's go to Matthew's account just for a moment. And this is not a contradiction. It's just to give us some insight to this. Matthew's account starts in Matthew chapter 8 in verse 28. And it mentions that there were 2 demon-possessed men. You remember that story in Matthew? Mentions there were 2 demon-possessed men. And their questioning was a little bit different. Same story, same event, same place. But it mentions there are 2 men. Well, were there 2 men or 1? Well, Matthew says there were 2. But Mark focuses only on 1 because he's telling a story. And he's not trying to contradict Matthew. He's just simply trying to tell a storyline of what Jesus did. And here's the focal point of what he did with reference to this one man. Matthew mentions that there were indeed 2. Now, Luke gives us a little more insight, and we'll come to that in just a moment. Let's go and get the rest of verse 3. He was dwelling among the tombs, and no one could bind him, not even with chains. What had they tried to do, according to verse 4? Yeah, apparently because of the power of the demonic spirits, there is power. Satan does have power. There's no doubt about that. And because of that, and because of the number of demons that he has undue strength so that he's able to break from the shackles and from the chains. So they tried to bind him in chains. They tried to tame him. They tried to get him under control. He's living like a wild man. He's living off like a caveman in the caves. Luke adds this. Let's go to Luke chapter 8. That he wore no clothes. Now, Matthew and Mark do not mention that, and there's a significance for mentioning that as we come to the end of the story. But you get a picture of a man who is behaving like he's out of his mind. He's living like a wild man in caves. They can't shackle him. They put chains on him. He breaks out of those chains, undue strength. And he doesn't wear clothes. And he obviously implied later in the text he's not in his right mind because of this demon possession. Now, the evidence of God allowing this, let me stop and footnote again, of God allowing this. The fact that the demons asked permission to enter the swine suggests there is a limitation of Satan's power. Satan is powerful. Demonic spirits were powerful. But evidence that there is a limitation of that power is they had to ask permission to enter the swine. Or else why did they not enter the swine? Why didn't they just do that to escape from going to the abyss? Which is what they were afraid of, being cast out of the earth. And we see that in Luke's account, and we'll come back to that here in just a moment. Why does God do that? God allows Satan to have power, though I can't find this stated, but it seems to be that he allowed Satan to have this power to demonstrate the power of Christ. Does that make sense? I know that's what happened, but whether that's why God allowed it, I cannot indeed find a specific reference to that. Now, at verse 5, we're back to Mark 5. We've learned that there were 2 men. He wore no clothes. And verse 5 now says, always night and day he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. So he's mutilating himself. He's not acting right. Obviously, there are demons that are possessing him. Now, beginning at verse 6, let's go back to our outline here at verse 6. Any questions so far? Comments? He comes and approaches Jesus. Now, what happens here? First thing he does, when he saw Jesus, He ran and worshiped him. Now, whether you stop there or go on and get verse 7 with that, let's go and get verse 7. He cried out with a loud voice, and what did he say? Yeah, what have I to do with you? Seemingly the demons are speaking through the man. And these are the demons speaking, seemingly. And what have we to do with you? What does that tell you about the demons? Even they believed. They recognized who Jesus is. They fell down and acknowledged him. I think that's the point of verse 6. Verse 7, they acknowledge him as being the Son of the Most High God. We recognize you for who you are and the power that you have. I implore you, I'm reading it in verse 7, by God, that you do not torment me. So harmonizing that with Matthew's account, the two men said, have you come to torment us before our time? In other words, they recognize the power of Jesus. He could torment us. He can overpower us. He has more power than we have. Seemingly, if I harmonize the two accounts, the one man then made the imploring of him, said, I implore you, do not torment me. So did you come to torment us? It was a question. And please do not torment me. Do not exercise your power. So I'm recognizing, if we don't get any further, they're recognizing the power of Jesus over the spirit world. So here's what I'm learning, and we're going to see a greater demonstration of that. We're going to list 3 powers that he had. And so you might write in the margin of your Bible that here is a demonstration of Jesus has power over the spirit world. Now remember, in our outline, we were talking, not this outline, but of the book, we're in the section of his identity, who he is. He indeed is the Son of the Most High God. Even demons recognize that, and that he has power over the spirit world. It's one thing to have power, but have power over the spirit world. The spirit world that has indeed power over men, Jesus has power over the spirit world. All right, let's go further. Now at verse 8 he said, Jesus said to him, come out of the man, unclean spirit. And then Jesus asked what? What's your name? And he answered, said, my name is Legion, for we are many. Legion was a reference to a band of soldiers, anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000. More lean toward the higher number, 6,000. Could be up to 6,000 of the Roman army. So when you talk about a legion of soldiers, you were talking about 4,000 to 6,000 soldiers in the Roman army. So my name is Legion because we are many. So suggesting that he is full of many demons that have inhabited him. Now, verse 10, we got to have some insight from Luke here to help us. He begged him earnestly that he would not send them out of the country. Now, if that's the only account we had, that would give us the impression that the demons are begging, don't send us out of the country. Don't send us out of Galilee or the region of Perea and send us, say, down to Judea or send us to Egypt. Don't do that. That's not what he's asking. Let's go to Luke 8. Look at verse 31, parallel account. This is where the synoptics are very helpful in biblical interpretation. Luke 8 in verse 31. It is a reference, most likely, to being cast out of the earth and into the abyss where demons would abide. So notice at verse 31, and they begged, lost my place. Yeah, verse 31, and they begged him that he would not command them to go into the abyss. To go out of the country and into the abyss are parallel. Make sense? Here's where Luke is giving you a commentary on Mark's account. Now, the one thing we haven't got yet, up and down his yes, back and forth his nose. Does that make sense? All right. All right. Now then, verses 11 through 13, we've seen his condition. He approached Jesus. Jesus then cast him into a herd of swine. Look at verse 11. There was a large herd of swine. How many swine were there? 2,000. About 2,000, according to verse 13, that were feeding there. And the demons begged, saying, send us into the swine that we may enter them. Again, by implication, Why beg if they have the power to do that themselves? There is limitation to demonic power. So whatever power Satan has, if we don't get any other lesson this morning, Satan has power. He has his grip on the world. Satan enters the minds of people. Satan has power over, he's the prince of the world. Whatever power Satan has, there's a limitation of the power. Make sense? Because they have to ask permission to enter the swine. Why didn't they just run to the swine to start with? They can't do that. They had to ask for permission. Then the unclean spirits, verse 13, went out and entered the swine. That is verse 13. Jesus gave them permission, and the unclean spirits entered in the swine, and they ran down the steep hill, and they drowned in the sea. And now we'll pick up at verse 14 to know about the reaction. Now, notice Jesus' connection with some things that are unclean in this context. I don't know what to make of that. I'm not sure there's a practical point, except he's demonstrating his power around things unclean. The swine are unclean. The demonic spirits are unclean. Ceremonial unclean. They're spiritually unclean. The woman with issue of blood was unclean, according to Leviticus. And so repeatedly there's some unclean things that Jesus comes in contact with, and he demonstrates his power in the midst of that. I'm not sure what to make of that. That's just an interesting thought. Maybe you can make something out of that and come up with some lesson we learned from that. What reaction now in 14 through 20? In fact, I think we've got a question on that. Do we not? Where's my question? If not, yeah, no, I don't either. I should have asked that, though. I'll ask it now. What was the reaction? 14 to 20.
They saw the difference in the man that had the demon possession, but they also were upset that their lack.
Yeah, varied reaction. Let's work our way through that. They're impressed, they're amazed, and they're afraid. All of that's going on in this context. Look at verse 14 beginning. Those who fed the swine fled. And they told it in the city and in the country, and they went out to see what it was that happened. Now, can you imagine? That's not just 10 or 12 hogs that you got out here you're feeding, and suddenly they run down. But if you could imagine having 2,000 hogs on this hill feeding, or cows or whatever it is that you have, and suddenly they all do the same thing immediately, and like they've become possessed somehow, which they had, and run violently down the hill and drown in the sea, and you're taking care of these hogs, and you've never seen anything like this in the history of your life. You haven't heard anything about this in all your life. And they saw it, and they're amazed, the text says. And they went and told everybody in the city, and people had to come out and see what it was. Well, there's nothing to see, unless there's some floating hogs now. Maybe that they could see, but what in the world happened? They were up on top of that hill and they ran down the hill, and now they are in the sea. You see some of them floating out there now.
Don't you think they wanted him to depart and leave and asked Jesus to go, and I would have been happy to have him there?
Yes, they don't understand this power. Because, and I take it from this, I want to get to this at verse 17 in a moment, but I take it that they recognize this power of the demons, because they'd gone out and tried to corral this guy and chain him up and bind him and whatever they could do to help him, and they see the power. He just breaks through and breaks the chains, and we can't hold him. And whatever Jesus has is greater than that. They don't understand it's good power he has and not evil power, but it's the concept he's got greater power, and we're afraid of that power, and so just get out of here. We don't want you around. That seems to be what it is, because Luke says they were driven by fear. I want to come to that. Good point. Good point. Let's get at verse 15 now. And they came to Jesus, and they saw the one that had been demon-possessed, had the legion. He was clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. So the people come out of the city, and they come, and everybody knows this guy, apparently. And he's been a wild man living in the caves. He's been naked, and now he's got clothes on, and he's acting sane, and he's acting right. He's acting like he's got sense. He's not wild. They know something has changed. And so again, Jesus has power over the spirit world. That's been demonstrated. That's what we're wanting to learn from this. Perhaps there's something practical. I'm not sure that's the point of verse 15. But when he was clothed, he was in his right mind. There's a connection being in your right mind and being clothed. When he took his clothes off is when he was out of his mind and demon possessed, what that may be worth to us. But notice the fear at verse 15. We'll come back to that in a moment. And those that saw it told what had happened about the demon possessed, about being demon possessed, and the one who had been demon possessed in the swine. Now verse 17. They began to plead with him to depart from their region. Let's go look at Luke 8:37. You might make a marginal note that Luke 8 gives us a little insight to that. In verse 37, they asked him to depart from their region, for they were seized with great fear. In other words, they're afraid. And again, I take it, the demons have power. They were fearful of the demons. Jesus has greater power than the demons. We don't fully understand what this power is. Because, again, you'd think if they fully grasp who he has power over the demons. He can cast out demons. So if you have a friend or a neighbor that's demon-possessed, he can take care of them. You'd think they'd want him. They don't understand Jesus. That wasn't the last time people didn't understand Jesus. And they want to push him away because they don't understand who he is. People think that Jesus is out to destroy their fun. And so he needs to depart from my region because he's destroying my life and my fun and my family, when actually Jesus is saving your life and saving your sanity and saving your family if you turn to Jesus. Well, that would almost preach a little bit, wouldn't it? Let's see what's next. Verse 18. Now what happens at verse 18 and 19?
Demon-possessed man who wanted to go with him. Jesus told him to go back where he said, stay there.
Yes. He wanted to go with Jesus. Now remember the question he asked at first, what have I to do with you? What have we to do with you, Son of the Most High God? Have you come to torment us? That's the demons actually speaking. But once the demons are gone, he recognizes the power of Jesus. I want to go with you. He wants to follow Jesus. He wants to be with him. Unlike the people who are asking him to depart and get out of the region, he wants to go with Jesus. He wants to be a disciple. But Jesus tells him to go and tell your friends all the great things. In other words, you'll accomplish more about telling them about what I've done. And notice what else he mentions. Not only what was done for you, and how he has compassion on you. Now I take it that verse 19 is telling me what was missing at verse 17. Get my connection? They're asking Jesus to depart because they're not understanding his compassion. Does that make sense? They don't see that. He saw the compassion. So you go tell the compassion that I have for you, how much I care for people. And you go spread that news. And so the end of that section, he departed and began to proclaim all that Jesus did, and he did that in Decapolis. Well, that's down here in this region right here. If our understanding be correct, that it's along this shore somewhere about 6 miles off this shore in this region here where this took place, then he comes down here in this region of Decapolis and he's proclaiming what Jesus did. And so he's spreading the news about Jesus. All right. Jesus has power over the spirit world. Questions or comments?
I've always thought it very practical to draw other things from the swine there. One of the things that I think is if you've got something unclean in your life, sometimes animals are smarter than people. They'll do whatever they can to get rid of it.
Yeah. Good point.
Question, maybe speculation, but just curiosity is keeping you. You have here a situation where the demons recognize who they worship him, and we see that he still drove them out. Is there a connection between Satan and his agents? They're being reserved for punishment. Can I make that connection?
You can, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know.
It appears their fate was already set because even though they're recognized and worshiping him, it didn't change it.
Right. I don't know of any time or any place where a demon changed, and because of his faith that he became a true believer, and therefore, so that very well may be in light of Jude 6 and those passages, Jude 6 and 7. And it may be too, and I've wondered, and I can't prove this, but I've wondered if it's not also that while they recognize the power of Jesus, if they submit to him at all, that they lose their power. And I don't know, but your thought there may be correct. I can't refute it, but I don't know if I can prove it either.
Seems interesting that the demons have been tormenting this guy, and yet when they see Jesus, they ask him not to torment them.
Interesting. It is interesting. Which Satan doesn't always play fair. Demonic spirits don't play fair. I can do to you, but don't you do that to me. I can be ugly to you, but don't you be ugly to me, because I ain't going to stand for that, but I'll be ugly to you if I want to. That's how Satan works. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about, not that, let's talk about the raising of Jairus' daughter. And let's get the parallel accounts. Now, the parallel accounts is going to include both of the next two miracles, the raising of the daughter and the healing of the woman with the issue of blood. Anyway, the parallel accounts, if you care to write them down, Matthew 9, 18 to 26, and Luke 8, 40 to 56. There is some variation in the accounts. That's why we need to look at the accounts. Matthew 9, 18 to 26, Luke 8, 40 to 56 is where we are. Now, let's go back and let's talk about the raising of Jairus' daughter. Let's get to the point of what we learn. And the raising of Jairus' daughter, the lesson that we learn is Jesus has power over death. Now, it's one thing to have power, but the three miracles that are chosen here by the Holy Spirit to record for us in the Gospel of Mark demonstrates three great powers. He has power over the spirit world. He has power over death. Let's get ahead of ourselves. And in the third case, right in the middle of all that, he has power over disease. So he has power over the spirit world, power over death, and power over disease. Great power he has. Talking about the raising of Jairus' daughter. Let's see where I start. They came back to the other side. I take it that they went back across to the west side of the Sea of Galilee. They came to the synagogue. The synagogues were established during the Intertestament period, as you'll recall. You don't read anything about them in the Old Testament. Suddenly in the New Testament we have synagogues. Where'd they come from? They were established during this Intertestament period, during that 400-year period. It's a place of worship for the Jews. And one of the rulers of the synagogue, he must have been well known because he's mentioned by name, Jairus. The ruler of the synagogue was more of an administrator and a custodian. He supervised the preparation of the synagogue, made it ready for their worship. And when he saw Jesus, he fell down at his feet and he begged him. And what did he say at verse 23? My little daughter, she's at the point of death. We learn later she's 12 years old, about 12 years old. She is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her that she may be healed and she will live. Now notice his wording of that. Not come. He's already learned something about Jesus. Don't come. He's not saying come and see if you can heal her. Come and see if you can help her. What does he say? Yeah, you come and she'll live. If you'll just come, she'll live. I know that. That's true faith. Now Matthew's account, for what it's worth, Matthew 9 and 18 says that she'd already died. And I think we can harmonize that, and I'll show you where we harmonize that a little later, about verse 35 or so. I think Mark's account's a little fuller, and he's going to give us a place where that fits in. We'll get to that here in a second. So that's 21 to 24. And so there was a great throng following after Jesus. Now, we have an intermission here where there's this story about on the way what happened with this woman. I'm going to skip that for the moment, and let's start down at verse 35. While he's still talking to this woman, someone came from the ruler's house and said, your daughter is dead. Seems to me at this point is where Matthew picks up to harmonize the accounts. And they basically ask, why trouble the teacher anymore? And as soon as Jesus heard that, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not be afraid, only believe." And so, did he say, "Come and heal my daughter because she's near death," or did he say she's already died and come here? I think he said both. I think there's a way to harmonize those. And Matthew's account would probably begin and plug in right here at about verse 35. Thought I heard somebody say something. So who went with Jesus? Who did he allow to go into the room? Peter, James, and John. And then later, verse 40, he took the mother and the father. When he got there, the flutes are playing, etc., according to Luke's account. In other words, they're weeping because here is evidence that indeed she's dead. So this girl has indeed died. They're all saying she's died. And Jesus comes and said, "Why are you weeping? She is not dead, but she's sleeping." A practical thing to learn there is when we understand the nature of the resurrection, then that changes our whole outlook about death. But be that as it may, he comes, and what does Jesus say to her? Talitha kumi, which is Aramaic for, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately she got up and she walked. And they were all amazed and they were overcome with great amazement, the text says. Now, verse 43, might make a note if you don't already have this. He told them they were to give her something to eat. Reckon why? Do what? Well, he does care about her.
This is reminiscent of when Jesus appeared to the apostles, and he ate in front of them to prove to them that he was whole, he was human, he wasn't a ghost or spirit.
Bingo. Absolutely. He does care about her and he wants her to eat, but there are other people who needed to eat that I doubt the parents, while they're thinking she's been dead for a little bit, that they're thinking about, they probably needed to eat too. But this is evidence that a miracle has been performed. She was dead. They all knew she was dead. And he raises her up. And are we imagining this? Watch her eat. And there's evidence that indeed the body is whole. And so there was the raising of Jairus' daughter. Now let's back up in the middle of that and get 25 to 34. On his way, there is a woman that comes along that had an issue of blood for about 12 years, seemingly a hemorrhaging. And she had suffered much from the physicians. They charged her money, and she had not got any better and only got worse. She's just throwing her money away with the doctors who are not helping her. She's unclean as long as she never could be pronounced clean by the under Old Testament law by the priest, because there's still the issue of blood. Blood hadn't dried up. And she said, if I could only touch his clothes. Luke's account, Luke 8:44, Matthew 9:20, says she wants to touch the border or the hem of his garment. In other words, I don't even have to touch him. If she had such faith in his power, if I could just touch the hem or the border of his garment, if I could just take his robe and just barely touch the hem of it, that I'll receive some power. And verse 29, what happened? Immediately, the fountain of blood dried up, and she felt it in her body, and she was healed of her affliction. And Jesus knew the power immediately left him. And what did he ask? Who touched my clothes? Now, back earlier, verse 24, there was this throng of people around. If you can imagine where they're just kind of uptight, where everybody's just kind of pushed together. And Jesus said, who touched me? And the disciples asked, what in the world? Why would you ask that? We're all just pushed up together, and you're wondering who touched me? What's he asking?
Who with the great faith?
Who is the person with the great faith? He is calling for an admission from the woman to single her out so that she pronounces and she comes forth and declares. He's going to show that a miracle. In other words, nobody else knows a miracle has taken place, do they? She touches him, or touches the hem of his garment. She is cleansed of her hemorrhaging, and the whole crowd around don't know anything's going on. So Jesus singles her out. Who touched me? And so she comes forward, and she, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down and told him the whole truth. Told everything's going on. I came to you, da 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 da. Here's what I did. And what does Jesus say to her? Verse 34. Your great faith. He commended her for her great faith and gave her a pronouncement not only of healing, but of peace. She got more than what she asked for. So here's the three things. You tell me. Jesus has power over spirit world, power over disease, and power over death. That's the story Mark's trying to tell us. Make sense? His identity. We're focusing on his identity right now. Focusing on his identity. Questions or comments?
Spirits, he told him to go and tell what had been done, and yet the girl was on him.
Yes, that's interesting. The distinction in those two, and why is that? Good question, or good point. That he told the man who had the demonic spirits, he's going off into Decapolis. He tells him, you go tell your family, and etc. Because in Decapolis, in that region, is not going to be the kind of animosity that stirs among the Jews. I think his point is, as we've seen repeatedly through Matthew and in Mark, that the time for full declaration is not at hand, and the opposition of the Pharisees, it becomes a distraction to the work that he's doing. And so don't tell this. In other words, it's not time for full declaration. Let him lay his groundwork ahead of time. So there is time for broadcasting a message. There's time when you hold back, and we're not ready to fully reveal that because it's going to stir opposition. Make sense? And this may be a poor illustration, but perhaps let's just suppose that we've got a whole county full of Muslims. And let's figure, first of all, we don't have a bunch of Muslims around. And we're going to have a special on Islam here. And it's a month away, so we start announcing 6 weeks ahead it's going to take place. If there's not a bunch of Muslims around, we're not liable to stir anything up. So let's get the word out it's going on. But suppose we had a county full of Muslims and we wanted to deal with that. We might not want to broadcast that until it's time to broadcast it because of the opposition it stirs. Make sense? I mean, that's not the best illustration, but I think the difference is in the area. Back on the one side of Galilee versus over in Decapolis is the distinction. Questions or comments on chapter 5?
You know, this lesson started out with him going to the other side of the sea. And then when we get to where he restored the girl, he went back to the other side.
Yeah. Over.
What he was doing was getting out of it. This man knew all he had to do was come and look at his daughter. She would be healed.
Just come and
In our lives,
yeah.
It's happening.
And that's a good point. And two, there's the synagogue over here where there's Jews. To answer the question you raised a moment ago, there's Jews around. There's no evidence of, or we don't have a reference at least to a synagogue on that side of the Sea of Galilee, over on the far side of Jordan. There's Jews over there where there'd going to be great opposition. Any more questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Faith in general, there's a lot of discussion or a lot of things we can see about faith in this chapter, but specifically with Jairus, he shows great faith. He says, I know if you come and touch her, she'll be made well. And it's interesting to compare that to the centurion that comes to Jesus and says, just speak it. They're both commended for their faith, and we see great
Good point.
variation.
Yeah, great faith. Good point. Next week, gospel meeting, 2 weeks from today, Mark 6.